I should say the things have changed in some ways.
Who is the determinant of the public interest?
The more time people spend in digital worlds, the more of our lives we live there.
Intercoin, bringing power to the people. Hey, everybody. Welcome. We have here Dr. Harvey. David Harvey is joining us again. If you remember last time, we had Dr. Harvey and Noam Chomsky on the show. Today, we're being joined by Thomas Greco. And I want to share my screen and kind of go over the backgrounds of these two men. Both of you guys are in your 80s, by the way. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. I noticed that I'm only 1 year younger than David.
So I guess, David, you can share some of your secrets of how to, for the young man over here. So I want to kind of go over your backgrounds. You guys have both been working for decades in both the analysis of socioeconomic issues as well as political, right? I mean, there's a lot of intersection with what's been going on. David, you are essentially, is it fair to say you're a geographer of economics?
Yeah.
You have, been coming at it from a Marxian perspective, studying Karl Marx, his writings, and how to analyze current situations from that viewpoint. Also, Thomas, it's very interesting. Is coming from a different perspective, which is community currencies. Is that fair to say? Community.
Well, no, it goes much deeper than that. You know, I come at it from the perspective of, what are the problems that we're facing? And once I get a handle on that, then I try to look at what are the roots of those problems. So I don't talk in terms of ideologies. I talk in terms of problems and solutions and the mechanisms by which the problems arose.
Okay, very good. So in today's show, we're going to delve deeply into the problems facing us today. I'm sure there's numerous ones. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be sharing my screen. Actually, hold on, I'm supposed to be sharing just one window. And
okay, actually, let me note,
please,
Greg, that Wikipedia, I don't really trust Wikipedia anymore. They have improved somewhat my personal page on Wikipedia, but I found a couple of years ago that even trying to update my bibliography on there, they wouldn't allow it. And every time we would make a change, either me or someone associated with me, it would be reversed. So I'm not sure that they've got all of the information that's necessary. It looks better than it did, but
well, yeah, I mean, no tool is perfect, and this is certainly a topic I want to talk about. We spoke about it last time: collaboration versus competition versus, having individual, like Britannica, for example, is a capitalist version of Wikipedia in the sense that there's one corporation. It was sold door to door. It raises the money and then pays all the people to write the article. So it's likely Britannica would not even have an entry for yourself or Dr. Harvey, but Wikipedia does. So I wanted to kind of go over it. Perhaps so to introduce, I guess let's start with David Harvey. David Harvey, born in 1935. You immigrated from the UK, right? I would love to hear how you came to the United States as well. And what drew you here. You received your PhD from the University of Cambridge before coming, and you are currently also the author of a book, A Companion to Marx's Grundrisse. So I'd love to sort of get your take on, how did you come to this Marxian perspective initially, and what brought you to the United States in the beginning?
Okay, you want me to talk about that history?
Please, it would be fantastic, yes.
Well, I was working away and I had a after I did my PhD, I taught at the University of Bristol in England, and conditions were very bad in academia at the time. The pay was poor and everything was kind of pretty messed up. And at that time in the 1960s, there were a lot of jobs going in the United States. And there weren't that many people in geography, trained in geography in the United States. So many universities raided British universities. And I was part of that raiding and became part of a brain drain. So actually many people in geography of my age actually come from either from Britain or from Australia, New Zealand, places like that. So there was a strong kind of migration of that kind. Now, there's a saying which says that when academics move from Britain to the United States, they either become rabidly right-wing or rabidly left-wing. And I think there's some truth to that, because one of the things that shocked me about the United States was to encounter all of the poverty and the misery that was going on in the city of Baltimore, where I located and where I started to do a great deal of work on housing questions and what went on during the sort of uprisings of the 1960s after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And at that time, I was basically using conventional economics to try and understand the situation, and more and more I found I couldn't do it. And so I said to some graduate students, let's read Marx and see what goes on there. And I started to read Marx and started off thinking about use value and exchange value and all those kinds of things. And suddenly it made a lot of sense. And so I've never looked back since. I've been sort of delving deeper and deeper into Marx's political economy in order to try to help understand some of the dynamics of contemporary capitalism. And that led to the companion I wrote to Marx's Capital Volume 1, and the companion I wrote to Volume 2. And then along came COVID, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I was sitting at home. I couldn't go to my office. What could I do? So I sat down there and wrote a companion to Marx's Grundrisse. So it's a product of the viral infection and the lockdown. And I learned a great deal from the exercise, and been very excited by some of the findings that come out of the Grundrisse. So
all right, so you know, it's almost meta how you moved from Britain to the United States, you know, and you talk about geography and you talk about people moving. So naturally, you know, mentioning the brain drain is very interesting. I think we should get into how countries pull, you know, talent and other resources away from each other, and how resources move between countries. So I think I understand that part, the macroeconomic. But then you also mentioned you wanted to study the local geography, right? Are we talking about sort of gentrification, or how highways are built through less affluent neighborhoods and how that affects people? Is that kind of the some of it?
Well, those are the sorts of things, but primarily I was very, very interested in what was called the urban crisis of the 1960s, which is the uprisings in Watts, in Los Angeles, in Detroit, and then in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King. Something like 300 cities in the United States had uprisings and, you know, burnings of the streets. So I arrived in Baltimore 1 year after the urban crisis took that particular form. And so I became involved in the question of, well, where was the unrest coming from? Why, in the most the richest country in the world, was there so much appalling poverty? And of course, there was the racial dimension, which was incredibly significant at the time. So there was a civil rights movement, there was an anti-war movement, there was the beginnings of an ecology movement. It was 1970. It was, I guess, the first Earth Day, somewhere around then. So there was a lot of things going on, and a lot of questions being posed. And it seemed to me that conventional economics and conventional social theory had very little idea about how to understand what was going on. So that's why I started to kind of say, let's take a look and see if Marx can help us. So I often mention this to people because I didn't really start reading Marx until I was 35 years old. So it's not as if I was a sort of a red diaper baby or was born up in that background. I sort of really came to it in part through intellectual reasons, because the more I got into it, I had this fascinating thing where I delivered a report on Baltimore housing to bankers and to housing officials and the federal housing officials, to some landlords and all the rest of it. I did all of this, and the whole analysis was cast in terms of the relationship between housing as a use value and housing as an exchange value, and that the exchange value system was not actually delivering housing for the mass of the population in an adequate way. So I was using those concepts very early on, and it was very interesting to me that when I presented the report, everybody said, oh, that's a very interesting way to look at things. Even the bankers were saying, that's a very interesting way of looking at things. And of course, it all came from page 1 of Marx's Capital. I didn't tell them it came from page 1 of Marx's Capital, because if I did, all hell would have broken loose. But I got more and more confidence in Marx's way of thinking and Marx's analysis, that Marx is concerned with social processes and is very much concerned with how those social processes work out, as opposed to an analysis which is about the manipulation of things. So that was my great insight that came around 1970, 71. I mean, that was when I wrote my first Marxist-leaning book.
So we're going to get into that. And I think you touched on another topic that we're going to get into and talk about after I introduce Thomas Greco as well. But before I do, I just wanted to point out the topics. You mentioned, you came in the 60s. This is definitely a time of social upheaval, social unrest. You had the civil rights movement. You had, as you said, race was top of mind for a lot of people as well, racial relations. And I want to talk about how you see things today. And we're going to talk about, George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter, for example. How do you see this comparing to the civil rights movement before? But I want to go back a little bit and also mention one other thing. And then Thomas, we'll start with you as well. Besides Marx, there were other people in the 19th century, David Ricardo, for instance, but also on this side of the pond. One of the celebrated books was Progress and Poverty by Henry George, which also talked about similar issues 100 years before. And we're talking about issues, or 80 years before. Why is there so much plenty and yet so much poverty? Right. And so I guess my question to you is, and I asked this with my interview with Dr. Greco as well, is in the past, what do you think of, have you read Progress and Poverty? What do you think of Georgism or Henry George and his prescriptions or analysis?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a long time since I read Henry George. But of course, the main line that Henry George takes is that which is contrary to the landlords. And basically, Henry George was, if you like, emphasizing the parasitical role of land rent and land ownership. And he treated that as being one of the major reasons for inequality in society. I actually think that George evaded in some ways some of the issues that Marx raises about the creation of profit through the exploitation of living labor in production, and that so that Henry George is just, if you like, for me, Henry George is located in volume 3 of Marx's Capital, and of course I'm also into volumes 1 and volume 2 and all the rest of it. So. Yeah, Henry George is an interesting character, and of course, there's a lot of utopian thinking, which came out of the sort of Henry George way of thinking, like Bellamy and so on. So this was a very fertile period of critical analysis, which came from the Henry George tradition. But I would want to go further than that by absolutely trying to talk about the origin of profit through the production of surplus value, through the exploitation of living labor and production, which is basically the central part of Marx's argument.
Right. All right. So yeah, because I find that Henry George was also enormously well received around the world, mostly by classical liberals and people who want to work within the system, kind of reform the system. And many of the socialists were revolutionary socialists. We talk about using the apparatus of the state in order to create a revolution of the proletariat versus having the one tax, or having a sort of a, having a laissez-faire economy with a one tax or something like that. All right. So I want to turn to Dr. Greco, Thomas Greco Jr. Also want to ask about your personal life. So Junior, so your dad was also Thomas. Can you tell us a little bit about your early life? I remember you told us in my last interview, you also participated in the 60s, right? Or 70s in the School of Living, which is an interesting organization talking about sustainable living, as well as, would you say it was part of the wider sort of communism or communal communes and people living communally in the 60s and experimenting in that way? So I'd love to hear about what you experienced around that time as well. And how did you get into community current, well, I think not just Litayer and community currencies, but as you say, having, well, let's get to it, having businesses issue their own form of currency, which is credits. How did you get into that? And can you tell us, all these movements that you've encountered over the years?
Okay, yeah, well, let me start, that's a lot to cover, but let me start by giving a little bit of my background. I had a degree in engineering, worked in the aerospace industry for 5 years, decided that I wanted to do something else, went back to school, got an MBA, and strangely enough, I was offered a job as an academic after I completed my MBA. I taught eventually for 14 years at Rochester Institute of Technology, and midway through that tenure, I received tenure and I applied for sabbatical leave so that I could work on my PhD, which I did at Syracuse University. So during that time at Syracuse, I got involved with some of the professors and others who were involved in the human potential movement. And I had a personal epiphany, if you will, and came out the other side with a new sensitivity to the problems that people face in everyday life, and a new concern for the issues of peace, justice, and equity in our society. So from that point on, I started to re-educate myself over a broad range of topics and areas. And I got involved with the Peace and Justice Center in Rochester, New York, where I grew up and I was teaching. And from that point on, everything changed. I began to understand that one of the biggest problems we have in our civilization is the centralization of power and the concentration of wealth in fewer hands. And so I started to dig into the causes of that and mechanisms that were used to create that situation. And I soon discovered that it was the system of money that is the keystone in the arch of power, both economic, political, financial, and every other aspect of power that you can name. And so I started digging very deeply into the money system, what is comprised of the money system, and how it works or doesn't work, basically how it malfunctions and misallocates credit and appropriates wealth and shifts power upward to those who control money. So that, in a nutshell, is the way I came to work with exchange alternatives, because I realized that the function of money, we're taught that money is three things: medium of exchange, a measure of value, and a store of value. Well, that is total hogwash. If you're talking about a gold or silver coin, yes, it might serve all those functions, but ultimately, the only real mechanism, the only real basis for an exchange of value is credit. And even when we had the gold standard, most of our exchange media were in the form of paper banknotes or bank deposits, and that's still the case. Increasingly, it's bank deposits rather than notes. And so we've allocated to banks the power to allocate credit on a preferatory basis. So banks get to decide who gets credit, who gets to create exchange media. As far as the measure of value is concerned, we need to measure value in terms of something concrete and real. And that's why we had the gold standard or the silver standard when the United States was first founded. The original definition of a US dollar was 371 1/4 grains of fine silver. Now that was never implemented as a coin, but later on we shifted over to gold as the measure of value. And for a long time, gold was valued at $22 an ounce. In other words, the US dollar was valued at that fraction of an ounce of gold, 1/22nd of an ounce of gold. And later during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt raised that to $35 an ounce after calling in all the gold. And so basically it was a devaluation of the dollar from 1/22nd of an ounce of gold to 1/35th of an ounce of gold. And then ultimately Nixon closed the gold window and said, even in international settlements, the dollar will no longer be convertible into gold. So we have a pure fiat standard now, where we have two meanings of the dollar. The dollar is both the currency and the measure of value, which is a ridiculous situation. So we need to get back to the separation of those functions. As far as the savings function is concerned, we don't keep our wealth in terms of demand deposits in a bank. We take those surplus funds that we have in dollars and we invest them either in stocks or bonds or real estate or some other long-term asset or claim on value. So that, in a nutshell, is where I arrived at and where I came from with this. So I long ago gave up on any attempt to reform the money system. There are a lot of famous quotes about how much power goes along with the power to create money. The father of the Rothschild dynasty said, "Give me the power to create a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." And that basically is the situation. And the current system we have of bank-created debt money that bears an interest burden goes back to the creation of the Bank of England. And at that time, King William III was fighting a war against France, and he needed money to do that, much more than he wanted to try to get through taxation of his subjects. So he made a deal with William Patterson and his cohorts. They came to the king and said, "We will give you as much money as you need to fight your war against France or do whatever you want, if you will give us, the Bank of England, the privilege of lending Bank of England notes into circulation at interest." So you had this pact, this diabolical pact between politics and finance, where the banks got to exploit our need for credit by charging interest for something that they were able to create out of thin air, and the government got to spend as much money as it wanted without looking at ordinary taxation sources. So, if you look at the growth of sovereign debt around the world today, particularly the United States, you see it going astronomical. And that's only possible because of this collusive arrangement between the banking establishment and central governments. And it's true around the world. National debts are increasing exponentially. So basically, we talk about the national debt. It's not really a debt because the debt is supposed to be repaid.
Mhm.
And there's no prospect of that debt ever being repaid.
Well,
so really, it's just a record
Hmm?
of the amount of value that has been appropriated by the government to fight wars, to engage in covert operations and overthrowing governments and undermining popular rule in countries around the world. So, civilization is on the brink of a disaster. And the only way I see around this is to create exchange media that are not controlled by the government, not controlled by the banking establishment, but controlled by the people. And so basically, this is a decentralist approach to solving our problems.
all right. So many topics that we need to talk about, and I think one of the spiciest is war, how money is used to finance war, right? Printing money. And what you said is right. Even in this country, in the United States, the dollar, as we know, even the cash that we associate with dollars today, the paper money had its start as the greenback. The greenback was issued in order to finance the U.S. Civil War. Which is the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history by far, with millions dead. And basically the greenback was such a success. It was used to pay essentially two things. At the time, the government had the power to levy tariffs, right, on trade outside of the country, as well as land taxes. This is the thing I spoke about with Henry George. And so because the greenback was available to be spent anywhere in the entire country, it became the most successful paper currency relative to what was then, it was called the free banking era. Every bank could issue some of its currency and so on, but this was explicitly issued to finance the war. And so afterwards, 1960, I think 1862, this is a mistake, the U.S. Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, making the greenback legal tender, just for people, 1862. So for people at home watching this, legal tender means that if you go to a restaurant and you eat and you incur a debt, if that restaurant takes you to court for not paying the debt, and you say, well, I offered greenbacks, I've offered these things that are legal tender, and the restaurant refused and said, give me gold, give me this, then the court will dismiss the case. So in other words, the court system is used to enforce debts. And in this case, the government says, well, this money is good for all debts, public and private. It's right there on the dollar, right? So this made the greenback even more popular. And eventually, obviously the paper dollar is very popular. And today we don't even talk about the paper dollar. We talk about phasing out paper currency because it's not trackable enough, and the government wants to keep track of everything that we're doing. And I want to talk about central bank digital currencies and central control. Before that, and just really quickly, I want to mention that both our guests here today have their own website and also have written books. I'd like to mention The End of Money and the Future of Civilization, which Dr. Greco, you wrote back in 2009. This is where you lay out your vision for how to essentially get money to be issued by private concerns, right? By companies.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this outlines both the history of how the money power became concentrated in the hands of the cartel and the government, and also what we can do about it. So the first part of that book is descriptive, and the second part is prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
Lay out my decentralized solutions to creating exchange media that are outside the realm of government and the banking cartel.
Mhm.
And so basically, it's what I say, reclaiming the credit commons. Credit is a commons. You know, we live by the exchange process, as Adam Smith noted a long time ago. It's very little of what we need that we produce for ourselves
Mhm.
by exchange. And money was invented to facilitate that process of exchange. But money being captured by the banking and political combination has basically disempowered people. So we have to reclaim the credit commons, take control of our own credit,
All right.
and allocate it to those that deserve it and need it to give us what we need to live.
So we have, I think, a lot of agreement on what the problems are, and I think the solutions might be radically different between Karl Marx and what you're proposing. Just for 2 minutes, I wanted to really quickly just introduce myself. I rarely do this, but I think it's important because I've spent the last 10 years building decentralized systems. So basically, the thing that you're talking about, you know, I'm building the open source alternatives, not just me building it, but this entire industry of open source software that has built Linux. It has built, you know, WordPress, which powers 40% of all websites in the world. In fact, the web itself is radically open source. You can look at the source code of any website. You know, it's an open protocol, HTTP. And it has in many ways enabled the type of communication and collaboration around the world that was previously not possible. So you have the internet, you have the web, and you also have voice over IP, which has essentially, you could say, reduced the monopoly of the telecom cartel, right? The Ma Bell was split up by government, but then government had decades to bring down costs, and the costs were still, I remember, about $3 a minute for long distance phone calls, right? 20 years ago, maybe $1 a minute. And then came voice over IP, right? It was nonviolent. It was just a standard over the internet. You could send packets of data. And so you didn't have to tie up the long distance line anymore. Everyone could share the data in a sort of a free market of high speed data brokers and pipes. And so these telecom companies suddenly found themselves competing with Skype, competing with all these free, almost took the cost down to zero, much, much faster than government ever did. And so I represent a sort of movement of open standards, open software. And so my two companies, just really quickly, for anyone who's interested, and I think you guys are as well, this is the information. So today we have big tech and we have big finance. Twitter and Facebook are owned, essentially controlled by one guy, Zuck and Elon, right? For various reasons. One is shareholders are unable to vote out Zuck, and Elon took the company private with a bunch of sovereign wealth funds and so on. So he's also the king over there. And our public forums are essentially going through these platforms, and people are looking for open alternatives. So qbix was about that, and then Intercoin takes that to the monetary and the blockchain space. And so the Web3, so this is Web2, and then Web3 is sort of this idea that we can exchange value globally, and it's almost too free because the governments obviously want to say no, you can't send money to Iran, you can't send money to North Korea, right? And the North Korean government is also coming there. And just this week, past week, Kuwait banned crypto payments, and today or yesterday, Russia banned, just passed a law, July 15th. Oh, sorry, this was a week ago. I apologize. Russia passed a law banning all digital payments in Russia. It's a question, open question, whether you can pay across borders, but within the country, these governments want to have their own money supply, and like you're saying, Thomas, their own CBDCs, the central bank digital currency. They're explicitly saying, for example, this is to protect the ruble. And we've heard Trump in the United States say that Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar and so on. So, you know, we have Fed now and so on. So Intercoin is essentially just building open source software that people can use And then we'll see whether or not they use it. If it happens to be like WordPress, or it happens to be like these other things like BitTorrent that is used around the world to share files, it may very well be a tool that people use and governments need to contend with and accept, kind of like personal printers or personal blogs. It's just a fact of life that people have these tools now. And the question is, what will they do? So that's kind of the discussion. All right, so I wanted to delve into the control of money by government and the control of commerce by government. I guess turning to you, Dr. Harvey, how do you view the role of government in affecting the transition that Marx advocated? And first of all, has the vision changed? Is it still workers taking over their own factory and collectively owning the means of production only in their own factory? Or is the advent of public stock markets with Edward Bernays and popularizing it, being able to own a share in anything, has that changed has that made it easier? Because in some sense, the stock market represents a form of collective ownership of corporations which own the means of production. So, what is the role of government? What would you like to see happen? What do you see the solutions as being? What would Marx say today, I guess?
Well, I'm actually on this matter, I don't know what Marx would say, but I have some questions as much as answers. And one of the questions for me, over the years, I've more and more dwelt upon the date of August the 15th, 1971, I think it was, when the US went off the gold standard. And I don't know why that happened. Did you have any good explanations as to why Nixon did that?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The reason was that we couldn't afford to redeem dollars for gold. We had so many pseudo dollars floating out there in the world. If everybody came to claim gold, there wouldn't be enough by far. President de Gaulle tried to do that. I think it was in 1958 or somewhere around there. And
Yeah, I remember.
And it was refused. And when Germany tried to get its gold repatriated, that was refused. Who knows where the gold is? It may not even be in the United States anymore. Probably isn't. So, you just can't put out fake paper money forever. It's not really paper. It's bank deposits and notes and bonds and things like that. But you can't do that forever without obliterating the standard. And the gold standard was...
I also want to emphasize that the Bretton Woods system after World War II, the conference where almost all the state leaders had come, they had agreed that the US dollar would become the reserve currency for all these countries. And so, it was backed by gold at that time. But I think, right? Am I adding correct information here? Basically,
well, that was pushed through by the U.S. government. That was forced. I think John Maynard Keynes had a better idea, but that was rejected because he wanted to solve the balance of trade problem as well, and he wanted to do that by taxing positive balances on accounts, and that of course is a no-no because interest is the be-all and end-all of banking and power.
So you're talking about Bancor, right? Keynes's idea of having a basket of currencies, essentially.
The Bancor was to be a settlement currency between nations to settle balance of payments problems.
Exactly. It's similar to Intercoin's vision of having little communities around the world settle payments. So definitely there was this idea by John Maynard Keynes, but we went with the idea of having just the US dollar in the Bretton Woods system. Basically, the conference took place in Bretton Woods, and it required essentially the countries to keep gold as reserve. Keep US dollars as reserves. And the idea, I guess, was that US dollars would be easier to exchange. I mean, now we're seeing that change with BRICS and some say de-dollarization, as you know, maybe we've achieved peak dollar. So obviously it's not going to go to zero in countries' reserves, but it's starting to compete with treasuries from China and other things like Bitcoin, which is why countries may view Bitcoin as a competitor and crypto as a competitor. So anyway, Dr. Harvey, going back to what I was saying, you know, I don't know why. I think the reason Nixon went off the gold standard, honestly, is because France demanded the money, and Nixon's response was, well, then in that case, we're just going to change the rules and say that it's no longer redeemable.
Sure.
But
Sure.
yeah. So,
But
so
the gold standard was dead long before that. You know, what we had from the Great Depression onward, the U.S. government was no longer redeeming dollars for gold for individuals, but they maintained the redemption for international settlements.
so
You
you're saying
know,
they confiscated all the gold under, I guess it was FDR, right?
yeah, it was FDR. He called in the gold. He told people, if you have any gold coins, you need to turn them in. And not everybody complied with that, so there's still, you know, hoards of gold coins that are individual hands. But a lot of the gold was turned in, and you know, as I said, then he suddenly devalued the dollar from 1/22 of an ounce to 1/35 of an ounce. But you know, gold redeemability for individuals was ended. We had a gold exchange standard allowing international settlements in gold.
Well, let's go back. Okay, so let's go back then, because I think this opens up an important point. The reason why these countries got off the gold standard, besides the fact that they were heavily in debt after the war, but in fact, they did so because if you go further back, the money was issued by banks. So most of our money supply, like you were saying, is issued by banks in the form of credit to businesses and credit to people, with the consumer credit card happening. Dr. Harvey, you were talking about the consumer credit card boom starting in the 80s, right? In order to make up for the lack of labor, purchasing power of labor, right? Depressing wages. And so, but if the banks are issuing the money, you have sometimes imploding banks. So the banks are the ones inflating their currency, and the banks are the ones that don't have enough gold in the vaults. And so you have runs on the banks. And so it seems that runs on the banks led to the Great Depression, in the sense that 1/3 of the nation's money supply just went poof, because the money was credit money. And since there was not enough gold to back this money, people lost faith in a lot of the banks went bankrupt, kind of like what we saw happening now. But now we have the FDIC, and it took over the banks and you know, stabilized them. But back then, your bank went bust, that's it. You can't get your money out. So I think that led to the Great Depression, and so the government had to step in. And Keynes and his monetary theory were that, well, you have to print more money because people are just sitting around. You know, there's a plumber, he could fix a leak, but he's not going to fix the leak, so the leak doesn't fix itself. And so the idea was, well, pump the money into the economy. I think that's
Greg,
how. Yeah.
there are a few inaccuracies in your telling of the history, but you know, let's skip over that. You know, what caused the Great Depression was the fact that during the Roaring 20s, you had massive expansion of credit by the banking establishment. And a lot of that money was used to speculate in stocks. Everybody was buying stocks. And, you know, eventually when people are unable to pay the interest on the money that they borrowed, and as soon as there's a little downtick in the stock price, the margins get called and you have to put up more money, because you could buy stocks with, you know, maybe 10% or less of the price of the stock. That's called buying on margin.
Right.
And when the price goes down and wipes out your margin, you have to come out with more in order to keep the stock. Well, the crash of 1929 was when people couldn't do that. Stock prices continued to plummet. And so a lot of the excess that occurred during the 20s brought on the Great Depression of the 30s. So you had abundant money being created in the 20s, and then you had a deficiency of money in the 1930s. So everything went to hell because businesses were unable to pay their employees or their suppliers. That mushroomed because now the consumers didn't have any money to buy the products. And you ended up with 25% unemployment in the United States. You know, my parents lived through the Great Depression. I was born, and so were you, David, during the Great Depression. And you know, that was a big topic of conversation in our family for years after that.
There were a lot of communist and anarchist socialist movements, and I think the Communist Party, Eugene Debs, and so on, operating, maybe I have the years wrong, operating around this time. People who said that the solution was, in fact, for the people to collectively own the means of production, or at least wrest some of the control from the capitalist class.
Well, government owned the means of production. That's what communism is. That's
Well, we'll
not
get to
really
that. I think we need to get to that because there are versions that are libertarian. But actually, Dr. Greco, my question really quickly wanted to ask, so are you describing government being involved, kind of like Austrian economics with Hayek talking about business cycles being caused by government because of easy money, followed by hard, followed by essentially deleveraging?
Well, it's not only government, it's government in collusion with the banking establishment. As I mentioned earlier, you know, they're in bed together, inflating the currency and collecting interest on our own credit. Basically, we give the banks our credit and we beg them to lend some of it back to us, and we pay interest for the privilege, which when you really think about it is absurd. When we could use credit.
Just like the people who go on Twitter, they give their audience and their followers over to Twitter, right? Or over to YouTube and get a little bit back. But mostly these platforms are giant and they control your followers and they can deplatform you. Okay.
Very much the same.
So, Dr. Harvey, can you talk a little bit about labor and the purchasing power of labor and unions? You see a lot of unionization just now happening with the Teamsters Union, right? Throughout history, about 100 years, you had AFL, CIO, you had Teamsters, but now as we record this, there's a strike, with UPS. There's also another strike that is being negotiated. Can you talk about the labor part of this, and how did the bank start issuing consumer credit cards, right, to cover for the deficiency and mask sort of the what Piketty says, right, is the loss of purchasing power of labor. How do you see labor figuring into this?
Well, before I get into that, what Marx does is to say that money, fiat money, and credit money, and he distinguishes between those two. Both of them, however, are claims upon future labor. And that to him is a very important concept, because what it does is it says that you actually, when people borrow, they in effect surrender their capacity to labor in order to pay it all off. I mean, the obvious example of that, simplest example of that for the US audience is student debt. That students go into debt in order to get an education, and then there is a claim upon their future labor. They have to work to pay off that debt. So this, in a way, is where Marx starts to talk about the way in which labor gets dominated by indebtedness. Now, there are certain kinds of forms of indebtedness that Marx regarded as being positive and useful and significant. For example, one of the reasons you might need credit is if you have some investment which is going to be very long term, both in terms of its use. You build a railroad, or you build an airport, or something of that kind. Then you're building something that is going to be used. Now the assumption is it's going to be used, and Marx therefore again is always saying it's the future uses, which the creation of money and the creation of debt are jeopardizing, if you want to call it that. But those future uses can sometimes be highly productive, and if they're highly productive, then the debt can be paid off. So Marx uses this category of fictitious capital. All capital at a certain level is fictitious.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs, therefore, to be realized. Now, if, however, it's not realized, then you get devaluation of that capital. And one of the things that has gone on is the organization of the sort of real estate development, long-term indebtedness. So what Marx does is to say that you couldn't have fixed capital formation, particularly fixed capital formation of an independent kind, like roads and ports and harbors and airports and all those kinds of things. You wouldn't be able to build those things unless you had a credit system. And that therefore the credit system, in that sense, is a positive aspect to how capital works, because it allows those things to be built for a long time. Also allows people to consume things over a long time. Hence the great significance of Roosevelt's origination of a 30-year mortgage back in the Great Depression. Because again, what you're doing is essentially saying it's not only fixed capital in production, it's also what Marx called the consumption fund, which is required for consumption. So that you can't consume. How do you consume a house? Well, you don't consume it all at once. You consume it over a long period of time. So the temporality of these things and the differential turnover. So Marx actually talks about the positive role of credit and credit institutions in allowing the construction of long-term capital assets. Which Marx says, circulate in return, not for production of value, but circulate in return for interest, so that there is all of this kind of positive aspect. But then comes what is being talked about is to kind of say, well, part of the way in which this is organized is through stock markets and so on. And so you then get fictitious capital, which doesn't get used, doesn't get realized, and remains unrealized, and that therefore we have an immense amount of surplus liquidity sloshing around and huge claims on future labor. For instance, the IMF put out a report about 3 years ago in which it counted up the total indebtedness in the global economy, that is corporate debt, government debt, and personal debt, put it all together, and then divided it by the global population, and came to the conclusion that the global population was indebted to the tune of something like $86,000 for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. But that has all happened since 1970s, 1980s. And what we've seen since the 1980s, and this goes back to this kind of the consequences of going off the gold standard and the consequences of setting up an entirely new monetary kind of structure. And that monetary structure is interesting because it is both the pinnacle of the private sector and it's what I call it's about the formation of what I call the state finance nexus. That in fact, there are two institutions which are standing behind all of this. One of these is the Federal Reserve, which we haven't talked about at all, which is the pinnacle of the banking system. And the second is the Treasury Department. And it was always interesting to me in 2008, 2009, when there was a big crisis going on and nobody knew what to do. President Bush was hiding somewhere. Congress didn't know what to say. And the people who came out and said, okay, we're the ones who are going to settle it were Ben Bernanke, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, and Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Geithner as a special kind of figure in it. So those two people came out and they produced a a famous 3-page document which said this is the solution to the problem. That is, they're the ones who are going to actually dictate the future of capital, because they are, if you like, the personification of what I call the state finance nexus. And the state finance nexus seems to me goes back to the founding of the Bank of England back in 1694 or whenever it was, and that system is foundational. But what the system is managing is claims upon future labor.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how can those claims be exercised? Well, you know, we leave individuals who are indebted from student debt to have to do it, and you know, some people never manage to pay off their student debt.
Well, basically, it's interesting who issues the credit in the first place and who does the buying. You know, here when I looked up,
state issue of the credit, that's all in the side of the Treasury Department. The buying of the credit is very much about the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, in effect, does quantitative easing, which in effect buys the state credit. So it's a very interesting relationship between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, and those two key institutions, which seem to me to dominate how global capital works.
it seems that our government, the public sector, as they call it, borrowed to finance the Civil War. We see here a steep increase, the First World War, the Second World War. But now, for the first time, perhaps in most of US history, we're even above the amount, and it's quite steep. And there's no war, at least not on the level of World War II. Well, I should say.
Well, there is a war.
There is a war.
It's
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
not the same kind of war.
Right.
You know, we have this overthrow of governments around the world that has been part of the program for the New World Order for a long time. And, you know, there's a famous General Wesley Clark. He did an interview with, what's her name? Anyway, there's an excerpt on YouTube where he talks about being notified by an underling about the plans for the US government to overthrow governments in 7 countries around the world. And one of them was Syria, another one was Somalia, another one was Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. And, you know, we've seen a lot of those come to pass. They're still struggling to complete the overthrow of Syria, but, you know, they're not going to give up, because basically the US, the powers that control the US government today want to dominate the world and create this neo-fascist world government. And so any resistors are going to be removed, like Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and, you know, on and on. They're finding that Russia and China, however, are not so easy to push around. And so they're encountering resistance here. And a lot of the BRICS countries and others are now hopping on their bandwagon. You know, I wrote an article and posted it on my website, you know, a few weeks ago, talking about the end of dollar dominance around the world. And others have been talking about it too. And now there's talk about the BRICS issuing their own gold-backed currency as an international reserve currency. So, you know, the game is over. The question is, how much trouble is the Western Empire going to cause in the process of going through its death throes?
You know, as you've been saying this, I've been scrolling through the endless list of United States involvement in regime change, Wikipedia article. And it just goes on and on about all these countries that the United States has been involved in regime change. And I just go back to George Washington's farewell speech. It says, you know, malice towards none, you know, make sure that to beware of foreign entanglements, because I think he saw that the United States getting involved in so much. I mean, now we're involved around the world. And so, you know, far from just being the reserve currency, once you have the reserves, you need to fight to make sure you have that dominance because you're enjoying the cheap stuff, coming in. So I think no discussion of economics is complete without sort of naturally veering into this discussion of war and hegemony.
I'm a little skeptical about the end of dollar dominance. I mean, in the long run, that may be the truth, but right now, it's still a fact that most of the world's trade is financed by dollars, and the dollar dominance is still around. So it may be on its, it may be shaky in some respects, but I don't think it's gone. And I think the question of, how much will go on in terms of, making sure that it does not dissolve, there's going to be a big battle over that, I think. But that's to come. Doesn't seem to me it's going on right now. I mean, Russia and China have tried to set up a alternative currency structure, but nothing seems to be working very well on that front.
I do want to say that these economic alliances seem to bring countries together against a common enemy. So, like, for example, you have NATO as an alliance, a transatlantic alliance for now, as a military alliance against primarily Russia. They say also Iran, but primarily Russia. In the same vein, it seems that economically, if you have, the US is the hegemon or the boogeyman for these countries, they unite. So what is interesting to me is how longtime enemies like Iran and Saudi Arabia can join an alliance and cooperate in one sphere, which can lead to cooperation in a different sphere, like China, Iran, and has recently exercised leadership in sort of bringing together Iran and Saudi Arabia, something that the United States could have done. With the Iran deal, it had diplomatic relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia and could have exercised leadership. Instead, it seems that, in my opinion anyway, the Trump administration wasted that leadership, and now China stepped in and is able to sort of play peacemaker and perhaps end the feud in Yemen, which is a proxy war that they've had going on for a decade. So in a way, these economic alliances seem to give countries an impetus and, to actually get things for cooperation and actually like stop fighting each other. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I just don't know how to parse all of that, because the trouble right now is that look, it seems to me that the whole global system is breaking up into what you might call regional configurations, and in some respects, Biden's attempt to reinvigorate NATO as an attempt to encounter or counter that breakup, because right now I think we're getting regional configurations of macro alliances, but they're shifting and changing very, very quickly. The connection between China and Russia has been long in the making, actually, and it's interesting to see how that alliance is going to work, particularly on the question of the future of the Ukraine war. I think the United States has a vested interest in the continuation of that war, and is going to do everything it possibly can to make it sort of almost a permanent arms economy, because actually since 1945, one of the big ways in which capital has disposed of its own surplus values, which it's always had a problem with overaccumulation, one of the big ways in which that was taken care of was by the military establishment and the growth of the military industrial complex. And one of the things Marx comments about military said, this is like dumping value in the ocean. But actually, instead of getting devaluation, you get destruction of capital, because so we're actually wasting an enormous amount of productive capacity on war and military expenditures. But that's been going on since 1945. And I would argue that actually the stability of the global economy since 1945, and the reason it never went back into a Great Depression like the 1930s was having this outlet for surplus capital, which was the military stuff, the military arms race with Russia. And now, of course, every time Biden says they're lending $40 billion to Ukraine, they're not. They're giving $30 billion to the American arms industry. I mean, this is what is going on, and they cannot do without that, because otherwise they'd be locked into massive devaluation, and you would get a crisis of the sort of 1970s. The other thing, by the way, which capital uses as a dumping ground for surplus capital is urbanization. Look at the crazy urbanization that is going on in the Gulf states. Look at the crazy urbanization that we have even in New York City. It's just absolutely amazing. And a lot of that is just dumping surplus capital into the built environment. And actually, the Chinese got the United States and the rest of the world out of the Great Depression of 2007 and 2008 and prevented it becoming the Great Depression by a huge production of urbanization, building new cities, building new high-speed rail networks, everything like that. The huge, I mean, Chinese economy kept global economy going. What we've seen recently is the Chinese can't do it anymore. So where the surplus value is going to come from?
Well, one moment. I do want to make a distinction between these two things: dumping money into the military and military adventurism on the one hand, which you could say destroys people's houses and so on. And on the other hand, what I'm playing here right now is, building up UAE putting money into Dubai, or China with their Belt and Road Initiative, or, China in the last 20 years has, putting aside the human rights issues, which are extremely important, but China has essentially centrally planned its way into 20xing the average wage and moving the farmers into the cities and building these cities up like you're seeing here in Dubai. They called them ghost cities for a while, and they deride the sort of, they say central planners got it wrong. They overbuilt, right? But of course, it takes time for people to move in. If you look at the US vacancy rate under, you could say a free market system or close to it, whatever, a market system, there's about 11% vacancy rate in cities like New York, and certainly a lot of towns have emptied out, small towns not even making the news in the United States. So under a market system, it seems like 11 to 12%, let's say, is going unused and just used as, parking your money, like billionaires parking their money in real estate, whatever, and holding out for better rent prices. And under the more centrally planned, say, economy, which, or at least the Keynesian stimulus economy of China, you have also ghost cities, but in fact, they're not ghosts. Also about 11 or 12% or less now goes unused. So I guess there's a big difference, isn't there, between building something for people to use for their use value, right, and destroying something with wars and famines and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, except sometimes the buildings aren't used. There are whole airports which have been built which have been remain totally unused. So in fact, a lot of the building which is going on in New York City right now is for speculative gain, and most of it is for the upper income. There's a crisis of affordable housing. So there's no building of affordable housing going on. There's a great deal of building of new condominiums for speculative investment. So this is a waste of productive capacity.
Let's go to Thomas Greco's vision of how credit would be issued. So right now, I think it's fair to say credit, is either by fiat, it's requisitioned by government, as you could see, for wars, but it's also done so to fight a pandemic, which was a big huge thing in the last 3 years, right? They printed more dollars more quickly than ever.
Yes.
So we have government, and then we also have sort of the private sector, as I like to say, the mythology that we like to tell ourselves, like the American dream, the idea of home ownership. But of course, back here, home ownership could be sustained on one man's paycheck. First of all, because mostly one of the two parents of children, one of them went to work for a corporate job 10 hours a day, the other stayed out of the corporate workforce, or at least didn't spend 10 hours a day. So there was already like less labor supply available. And also there was less automation. And so each person's work was more valued because you actually needed all those seamstresses or all those lawyers. Whereas now with AI and automation, you need them less and less and less. And so what I see is that although the cost of goods has been going down, the cost of rent and housing has been going up. This is one of the, and so people are mostly saying, the rent is too damn high. I don't think the cell phones are too expensive, or even the food they've managed to somehow make it affordable compared to the famines, throughout history. So I think they've gotten things under control, but not the housing. And I think that there is a crisis coming with automation. And, I had Andrew Yang, we built the ad for Andrew Yang. I know him and the Forward Party. And I think there are movements to help create a universal basic income to try to mitigate these problems. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, besides government going on these spending sprees to, or to fight wars or to fight pandemics and so on, there is the collective mythology, which I write about sometimes on my blog, and I talk about memes and collusion, which happens all the time. So just to scroll down here just for a second, there's a long thing about Ukraine. Markets, memes, and collusion. So normally markets come and the buyers and the sellers, they work in their individual self-interest. But then what happens is when they collectivize, whether it's the American Association of Doctors, right, or the AMA, or whether it's labor unions, they collectivize. And what's interesting is there's a new type of collusion. There's a kind of collusion where they're using software, and the software is the one telling them how much to charge and what to do. So we've seen, Wall Street bets. We've seen these manias to buy this coin or that coin or this meme stock. But what's interesting is there's also two things happening. One is the hedge funds are all using the same software or similar models like Black-Scholes. The Black-Scholes models to value derivatives are self-fulfilling prophecy. The more hedge funds use them, the more accurately the model predicts what will happen. And so in a way, the model becomes the model that everyone uses. But what's interesting also is in the real estate market, there's this collusion by the landlords because they're all using the same software. And so what's interesting is, whereas before they'd compete against each other and defect, now the software simply tells them, hey, why don't you raise your rents to this? And they say, okay. And look, it's working well. And that's because the software is telling them to act in concert. So this is almost like a cartel or some sort of emergent cartel. And the government might be in their purview to investigate it. Anyway, here's my point. Here's my point. And I'm sorry to go on about this. I want to ask both of you actually, but this is what I see. The home ownership mythos, okay, has changed, where you used to be able to afford on one paycheck a house, 2 cars, or a car, a few kids, right? Take a vacation. Now you need both parents to work 10-hour days. Everyone's more productive. Everyone's paid less. And the mortgage, the financial instrument that's offered by the banks, that staple, the mortgage, the college, etc., had created demand for banking money because the mortgage is 30 years and you have to work hard to pay off the money. And people are told that you shouldn't rent, you should own. But what you're not told is you're renting the money from the bank in order to own the house. So you're still renting and you have to pay the rent in the form of interest over the next 30 years. And I think that's starting to change. And I think millennials And now Gen Z and others are starting to realize that, hey, wait a second, I don't need to own, or maybe they can't own, they just can't afford it, so they rather, do other arrangements. But in this generation, it's like the lowest form of ownership of anything. And finally, I just want to say the UN has this thing, or I don't know if it's the UN or if it's the World Economic Forum, that says by 2030, you won't own anything and you'll be happy.
That's Klaus Schwab.
Oh, is it? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. World Economic Forum. So, like,
we're well on our way to owning nothing, but I'm not going to be happy about it, and I don't think most people are going to be happy about it, because somebody is going to own it, and they're going to force you to pay rent in order to use it. And the problem with real estate is we have increasingly concentrated ownership of real estate, particularly residential real estate, in the hands of big corporations. There are cases right here in Tucson where corporations are buying up apartment complexes and raising the rent by 50%. There's one right down the street from me where that happened. And these apartments were occupied mostly by elderly people, and most of them had to move out because they couldn't afford a 50% increase in the rent.
So let's go back to socialist cooperatives just for a second. I happen to grow up in one. It's called Mitchell-Lama. There was this program that was these two senators in New York, Mitchell and Lama. And what they did is tax breaks for housing, that if you built it in a certain way, that it was a cooperative housing. And what would happen is you would get a big tax break. Now, what's interesting about that is Trump's dad, Fred Trump, actually built a bunch of these in my own neighborhood. The man also gave, money to Jewish communities and so forth. I have a lot of respect for Fred Trump. But what I want to say is that, Trump's own family took advantage of these things. And what's interesting is that these Mitchell-Lama developments that are all over New York, where I grew up, you look at them and they're quite well kept. The buildings are very nice. They're run collectively by a board, which is elected by the tenants, 1 vote per apartment. You have very nicely kept grounds in most of these things, like Penn South in Manhattan. I'll just give you some images from there just to show you. It's like an oasis within Manhattan. So whereas most of Manhattan is just buildings, and upon buildings, these guys happen to have a park and a bunch of places you could, I guess, walk your kids and everything like that. So the elderly that live there are people who moved in their 30s and 40s and just never left, because here's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
People vote with their feet, and the line to get into these things is much longer than people, people may age out, or they may die or go to a nursing home, but like they don't want to leave. And so my question is, like, it seems to me that if you let this run for 30 years versus the landlord-owned, privately owned buildings across the street, the rents are much, much lower, and you don't need rent control because there's no landlord class. There's no one is extracting the rents, which is an economic term. The people are voting their own rent, their own amenities, and is self-governed. So I want to ask Dr. Harvey, what do you think of modern day socialism in the form of credit unions, cooperatives, housing cooperatives, food cooperatives, and just in general, people eliminating the landlord class, and their shareholder is the person themselves?
Well, the crazy thing is that in the past, there have been all of these, everything from Red Vienna right the way through, which were really taking care of housing for modest income populations, and the answers were all already there. Then along came big capital and kind of said, we're not being allowed to speculate on all of this stuff, and so in a sense we've been through, this is what neoliberalism has been about for the last 20 or 30 years, is opening up all kinds of areas for speculative investment on the part of capital. So we now end up with cities that are sort of about 80% organized for the benefit of big capital, and you're left with 20% for the rest of the population to try and do something with, you know, all of these various legal things like land trusts and corporate and the unions used to build housing for their workers and things of that kind. All of those things all wiped out. But if we go back historically and look, you know, there was sort of eras when there was a municipal socialism going on, which was relatively progressive. But of course, it was not, it cut out a whole area of investment so that people couldn't speculate with it. And as you say about housing, so daily stuff has become much cheaper, but housing has become very much more expensive, relatively speaking. And the only people who can afford to have home ownership right now are those who actually inherited. To some degree, I inherited home ownership from my parents, and I could convert it into home ownership for myself, and it'll go to my kids. So actually, that's about the only way in which somehow or other home ownership is likely to be preserved, is by inheritance, because getting in without having that as a background is almost impossible there anymore. So this is you know, one of the crazy things in the world, and this is why this domination by capital of the political scene and the buying of votes and the buying of senators and all the rest of it, all of that is just a tragedy. That there were and still are all kinds of possibilities to return and to actually augment many of those traditional systems where there was social housing and, you know, funded by the unions and so on. It would be interesting to see if one of the unions starts to do that, whether the UPS workers start to say, hey, we not only want decent wages and all that kind of thing, we want to set up a housing cooperative movement so that the workers have a cooperative housing they can utilize. So there's also, you know, it's not as if there are no solutions out there, and there are no solutions that have been tried and have worked. It's just they haven't worked for capital. And right now we live in a world where everything has to be worked for capital.
What I hear from both of you guys is that there could be ways that money and housing can serve the people, and people can actually use it for productive uses. On the other hand, there seems to be a lot of rampant speculation and financialization and capital coming in to speculate on things and ruin them, if you will. So, Dr. Greco, can you talk a little bit about your vision? Is it a little bit, yes. and just tell us if it's a little similar, because we were talking about socialist cooperatives. I consider credit unions to be akin to housing cooperatives and others, in that the members own collectively the union, right? And they lend to each other, and there's no bank shareholder who gets wiped out like Silvergate or whatever.
Okay, I don't call those socialist solutions.
All right. Well,
to me, socialism is a centralized approach, and that means the government being a dominant player. To me, we need to decentralize power. Credit union was an attempt to do that. Mutual companies were attempts to do that. The project that you mentioned, Greg, is an attempt to do that. Why is there such a long waiting list? Well, whenever you set the price below the market of competing opportunities, you're going to have a long waiting line. There's one here in Tucson. It's called Strauss Manor. It's a housing accommodation for elderly people, people my age, and there's a 3-year waiting list because they cap the rent as at 1/3 of your monthly income. Well, of course you're going to have a long line. It's the same thing you had in the Soviet Union. You had long lines or lack of supplies because you were bucking a system in which there was competing resources that were demanding return on their capital. So you talk about capital as being an abstract thing, but I talk about controllers of capital. If you want to control capital, all you need to do is control money. And then you can allocate money to buy the capital that you want to control. So that's what we've seen. You know, we've seen the rise of corporations. That's another aspect of this whole problem. Over the years. Corporations used to be limited in terms of their lifetime and the things that they were allowed to do. A corporate charter would be, for example, 20 years. The first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, these were private corporations that had a 20-year charter. And the first Bank of the United States, when the charter expired in 1812, was not renewed. Likewise, the second Bank of the United States had a 20-year charter.
You're talking
And
about
Andrew Jackson
right?
single-handedly.
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson single-handedly prevented that one from being renewed. So, you know, now we have no limitations at all on corporate power, which is another main instrument of the centralization of power and the concentration of wealth in fewer hands. So the bottom line is the way in which money is created by making
Before we get to
at
that,
interest.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I want to let you get into that topic. Just to respond very briefly to what you just said, though, there's a big line in the Soviet Union for bread, and there was a big line for people to get into socialist cooperatives because the price is low. I just wanted to make a distinction here. There was a lot of people could get off that line and go into a capitalist cooperative, a landlord-owned building. But they don't do that because presumably they can't afford it or they prefer to stand in line. I mean, we know that people don't prefer to stand in line because 300,000 veterans may have died waiting for healthcare. Why didn't they go to a private doctor? Well, because they couldn't afford the private healthcare system in the United States. So my point is simply that it's not just, people waiting in line because, hey, it's so cheap. It's the wider problem of they can't afford anything else. That's
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's why we have so many homeless people too.
Yeah.
Part of the reason.
So that's a systemic problem. I guess what I'm saying is that socialism, when you say socialism government, I see many people saying that socialism is only possible with a government, with a state government. But there are libertarian versions of socialism. And the ones I've mentioned with the housing cooperatives could exist, and the school of living and the communes could exist with no government. It doesn't require government for people to get together and to socially own the means of production or their buildings or their corporation as an employee-owned company or a credit union. I'm just saying, can you recognize a form of socialism that is libertarian, a libertarian socialism, which is
yes, if you want to call it that. I use different terminology.
Okay. So yeah, let's go back to what you were saying now. How does the money originate? What are the sources and the sinks of the money in your system that you're proposing?
Well, let me reiterate what I said before about the way in which money is created by banks. Banks create money by making so-called loans, and they charge interest on those loans. Problem is, as time goes on, you owe more money because of the accrued interest than you borrowed. Now, where are you going to get the money to pay the interest as well as the principal? The only way you can get that is by competing with others in the market, others who borrowed money from the bank on similar terms. So basically, there's never enough money in the economy for everybody to pay what they owe to the banks. This is my usury conjecture, which I've articulated in a paper that I put on my website some time ago. So if you want to look into that, read my usury conjecture. So basically, that's the foundation of this system that centralizes power and concentrates wealth in the hands of few hands.
And the
Uh,
government steps in and prints more money and distributes that money partly in order to service the interest.
Well, the government doesn't do it directly. It does it indirectly in collusion with the banking system. So, David mentioned quantitative easing. That was an unprecedented step taken in the 2008 crisis in order to avoid interest rates on government debt from going sky high. So you had the central bank directly buying up assets in order to stimulate the money supply.
Right. It wasn't even in their mandate. They bought corporate bonds, which they just to prop up.
Yeah, buying private equities. Yeah, but also, that was a way of putting more money into the banking system so that the banks could continue to make loans.
What I found interesting, by the way, according to the Federal Reserve itself, is that they cut interest rates to zero. In other words, not interest rates, I'm sorry, reserve requirements to zero. So
that was
normally,
another move.
they got out of the business of regulating reserve requirements, and they officially said that on their site, that now the banks don't have to have any reserves.
Right. And some other countries have been doing that for a long time. No reserve requirements. The banks can lend into circulation as much money as they want, as long as they have enough cash in the drawer to satisfy demands for cash withdrawals. So the point that I'm trying to make is the bottom line in all of this problem is the way in which banks create money by making loans. The interest has to be paid one way or another, and it's either through inflation of the currency or by restricting credit and causing a depression and reducing people's income. But it's selective, when they create a recession or depression, it falls mainly on the heads of the small businesses and the workers who can't weather the storm. Otherwise, if they choose to expand credit on an improper basis, they cause an excess of pseudo money in the economy, which causes vendors to raise their prices in order to, avoid losses.
Well, Dr. Harvey, you talked about the consumer credit boom in the 80s. You mentioned that the purchasing power of capital was decreased by neoliberal policies of, Thatcher and Reagan and so on, and that the banks came in to offer consumer credit cards in order to smooth over, the months that people can't pay for things. Today, I think 50% of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck or something like this. They're one housing payment away from, being kicked out, I guess, and downsizing. Has this created a dependent class, or has it always been a dependent? Can you talk a little bit about the consumer credit boom? Do you think that, and its relation to labor, how is it masking the structural problems of the relation of capital to labor?
Well, part of the issue here is I don't see how, with a global economy of the sort that we have, that we can actually do without a monetary system of some kind.
I agree.
And then the question arises, what should that look like? But then there's the question of, well, okay, money which is used for loans. And the big question for me is, one of the big questions for me is, loan for what? When Blackstone, who's one of the people I choose to hate these days, comes in and borrows masses of money from pension funds to buy up the foreclosed housing, which it then rents out at a very high rate. That's the kind of loan I despise. On the other hand, some loans should be made to build, say, a bond to build a hospital, which will serve low-income populations, or loans to set up a network of healthcare centers, loans. My problem right now is what are the loans being used for? A lot of money is being borrowed right now to build condominiums all over New York City in the midst of affordable housing crisis. Those condominiums play no part whatsoever. Now, this is a kind of reformist kind of position I'm taking here, technically, because, you know, I'd like to see something much more revolutionary. But meanwhile, why are we not actually mobilizing as much of the surplus capital as we can, bundling it together in such a way that we first off buy up land and then buy up sites in such a way that we are able to build affordable housing for the mass of the population? You know,
I'll tell you why. It's not in the bank's interest to do that.
I know, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. It's not in their interest to do it because they're capital institutions and they're only interested in the future of capital, and that's it. But I'm arguing that there should be some way of actually pulling together a completely different approach to affordable housing, because there's a global crisis of affordable housing.
Yes, I agree. And the way we get to affordable housing is by creating a whole new system of exchange and a whole new system of finance. I make a distinction between short-term exchange credit and long-term investment credit.
Yeah.
The exchange credit is short-term.
Yes.
Money, in my mind, is that is honest money, needs to be a claim on goods and services that are available in the market now or shortly to arrive in the market. And the financing of long-term assets, as you described, needs to be financed out of savings, because as we accumulate surplus credits in the short-term realm, we invest those credits in new productive capacity that's going to pay off over a long period of time. So the other aspect of this is to eliminate interest completely from civilization and to go to shared equity or temporary equity or shared revenue models instead, because, you know, we see that the compound interest is an exponential growth function.
Yeah.
And we have this growth imperative built into the way money is created.
Can I also add to what you're saying? You guys are both agreeing that money issued now for immediate use has much more productive value than money for longer term projects that may have to come out of savings, which is coordinated by either credit unions, banks, or governments. What I'd like to just suggest, and this is something that I've been working on for a while, is universal basic income, or as we call it, instead of UBI, we call it VBI, voluntary basic income. Dr. Greco, you've heard me talk about this. Dr. Harvey, you've never heard me say this, but so the universal basic income is a concept whereby a city or a country gives money to each individual person equally. And so the people decide individually where to spend it. If that day they want to buy some food, they go buy food. If they need razors to shave, they buy that. So the money goes into the economy based on what individuals decide they actually need. And the people who have the biggest marginal propensity to consume are the poor, meaning the poor don't have a lot of savings. And so whatever they get, they're going to spend, and they're going to spend it first on their needs. So if we give out a universal basic income, then it's going to be spent on the types of things that people need first and prioritize that. Now, it is going to dilute the overall money supply, which is why we could talk about taxing the money back. And so we already have progressive taxation. We would then simply increase progressive taxation. We could also finally have the power to tax things like fossil fuels at the point of extraction or at the point of production. We could tax plastic pollution. We could tax factory farms. We could tax a lot of things instead of government helping to create these crops that have insane amounts of sugar and creating diabetes problems in the population, creating problems of obesity. Instead of that, the government could actually tax the very things that are antithetical to public health, to environmental health, and so on, and redistribute that money as UBI to the people. So what I see is there a role for either governments, or as we say, communities, local communities, to, on the one hand, tax their, issue the money to their citizens. And unlike a bank underwriter who has to guess that maybe the business will be solvent in 5 years and pay back and whatever, they don't have to guess anything. People will spend it as they need. And on the other hand, tax the money back and have all these newfound levers of creating, solving collective action problems, which otherwise people rebel, like the Yellow Vest protests, which, Macron decided he was going to tax fossil fuels, but it turns out the tax falls disproportionately on the working class, and they protested. So my proposal is to get rid of the protests by giving the people the windfall of those taxes, kind of like what Alaska does with the permanent fund. The Alaska Permanent Fund it's the only state in the union that taxes the fossil fuels at the point of extraction, and then gives it, they call it socialist. I don't think it's socialist. It is just a way to redistribute money to the people. Alaska's a deep red state, so I don't think their policies would go for socialist policies. It's just a way to get the people to decide how to use the money, rather than the bankers and the underwriters picking winners and losers. I wanted to just throw it out there to you guys, starting with you.
The Alaska Permanent Fund is entirely different from the universal basic income provided by central government. The permanent fund is funded by the state taxing the exploitation of the commons, that is the oil resources and the gas resources. So, it's fully funded by the oil companies paying at least a small portion of what they should be paying for the exploitation of the commons. Mm-hmm. When you talk about universal basic income being provided by the central government, as Andrew Yang has proposed, the question is, where's the money going to come from? The government can only give the government can only give what it takes from someone else. It's either going to take that by taxing others directly or by inflating the currency.
Yeah, the taxes. It would tax
this
things
is all
like
this is all staying within the current paradigm. It's a palliative for the problems of the system in the first place. What we need is a different system.
So you're arguing instead of a incremental tinkering around the edges, you want a revolution in the money supply. And Marx wanted a revolution in the relationship of capital to labor. Dr. Harvey, what do you think about universal basic income, the way that I described it? Giving it out on the one hand, and then taxing it back on the other hand. Instead of the banks giving us the money supply, what if the money was simply given to every person equally, and then the fiscal policy, the tax policy, would be done to remove money from circulation? Do you see that as a helpful?
One of the things that I really liked about Marx's Grundrisse is his emphasis on something that he calls, you got to look at the totality in order to understand the problems that may arise with particular formulations. Now, universal basic income sounds a great idea, until you kind of say, well, actually, people get the universal basic income, and one of the consequences is that the landlords raise rents, pharmaceutical products double in price, In other words, people are absolutely no better off because the totality is organized to try to extract and to make sure that the mass of the population don't actually participate in the welfare and the well-being that is technically within our grasp. So one of the things you have to look at is to kind of say, well, what kinds of things would capital do if it, and in fact, quite a few capitalists like the idea of a universal basic income because it secures their market.
So you're also saying it's tinkering around the edges of the current system.
Well, yeah, it's not even tinkering around. It's taking one moment or one element in a totality and saying that is what that's the silver bullet, if you like, which is going to solve all the problems. My answer to that is no, it's not the silver bullet, because everything else can shift and change and compensate for the universal basic income. So you're no better off than you were at the beginning. So in order to understand how that happens, you have to get to the center of what capital is about and why it is that the abolition of capital is absolutely crucial to any of these suggestions which we're considering.
Wow, so that's quite an explosive revolution.
Could I ask you,
the
David,
abolition of capital? Okay,
you talk
ahead,
about
please.
the abolition of capital. I think what you're suggesting is the abolition of the mechanisms that control capital. Is that correct?
No, it's the abolition of the social relation of capital, in which one class can dominate over another.
Okay, but capital in my mind is valuable goods and equipment and buildings and real estate.
Yeah, you see, but that's the physical definition of capital. Marx has a social definition, which is the social relation between capital and labor. He's at the center piece of what a revolution transformation has to be about.
Okay, well, you talk about guaranteed profits. We can look at Medicare and the drug benefits, and we see why healthcare costs have gone skyrocketing in the United States. Whenever government subsidizes anything, it's not the people that benefit, it's the providers benefit.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying.
See, Dr. Greco, I don't think many Marxists necessarily are for big government. I could be wrong. Actually, Dr. Harvey, not to put words in your mouth, are you also critiquing government and its role in, are they in bed with the capitalists, and you're saying that less government would actually lead to, can be compatible with this, with the revolution you're talking about?
The capitalist state is enemy number one. Now, does that mean that all forms of the state are impossible? I think that actually, if we're going to be able to deal with some of the major global problems like global warming and all those kinds of things, fossil fuel use and all the rest of it, we're probably going to have to need some governmental structures which are going to allow the association of the populations to organize in such a way to confront some of these massive issues which confront us right now. So I think that in the same way there have been many different kinds of state, this capitalist state is a very specific instrument which I'm very much against, and there's no way a capitalist state would actually be an agent for the construction of a socialist alternative. That doesn't mean that there is not some possible way in which we would think about institutions and governmental arrangements and consultations and assemblies and all the kinds of things of that kind, which would allow us collectively to deal with some of these huge, huge problems which we're now confronted with.
But we've seen over the last many decades, actually centuries, the progressive migration of power to the upper levels of government.
Right.
Local communities have been disempowered, the states have been disempowered, the provinces have been disempowered, and we've given more and more power to the central government. Lord Acton said, power corrupts. And that's absolutely true. I think we've observed this time and time again. So when you vest so much power in the hands of the top level of government, you end up with a corrupted government.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a decentralist. That's why I say that we need to devolve power down to the local community and even below the state level, and migrate up from there for things that need to be done on a national and international basis. But, you know, the income tax law was passed along with the Federal Reserve Act back in 1913.
Right.
And that gave tremendous power to the government. You know, it was supposed to be a tax on the rich initially, and, you know, gradually it became a tax on everybody, and mostly a tax on the poor and middle class. And the rich have their loopholes to get around it, or their offshore tax havens. So, you know, we've got to reverse that trend. And there's no reforming the national government. I think it's beyond reform, at least in the United States and the UK and most other Western nations. You know, we have to rebuild our government along with our economy and our financial and exchange systems from the bottom up.
How do you guys propose to do that? So I think we have an interesting dynamic here. I tend to participate in my own interviews. I call them discussions, right? When I had one with Noam Chomsky, when I had with Sarah Hanks and Patrick Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman, I always love to bring my perspective as well, which tends to be open source software, you know, new technology, enabling people to self-organize, and also the UBI, the Universal Basic Income. So I feel like I can represent that position well, and I'd like to argue for it, but also like I want to get your take on it. Do you guys actually propose that the only way to bring about your system is to fundamentally replace the current government, starting with maybe the US federal government, or to reform government so completely that it's an unrecognizable version of itself? Is there a way to do it gradually? Are there little things we can do now that will benefit people, or is it more of a revolution? I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Harvey. Is it, are you a revolutionary? Would you call yourself a revolutionary socialist or an incrementalist, or are you just a historian who wants to analyze Marx but doesn't take a position?
No, of course I take positions, and my worry is that if you look at the questions which we need to pay attention to right now, just take something like global warming and habitat destruction and the destruction of coral reefs and all kinds of things like that, and you kind of say, what kind of world can we construct which will give meaningful answers and reverse many of those destructive aspects? I agree entirely with the point that it's unlikely that the current governments will do so, because they're totally corrupted by, they become autocracies. Even when they or talk about democracy and all the rest of it, they're actually talking about the democracy of money power, not talking about real personal democracy. So the big question mark is how to start to rebuild institutions, whether it be from the top down or the bottom up. I don't really care, because we need an institutional restructuring, which is going to deal with the chronic inequalities which now exist at all levels, and the chronic environmental conditions. Those, just take those two issues and say, well, whatever we do, we've got to radically change what those two issues of.
So just to put meat on the bones and be specific, what is the end game? What does it look like? What are we aiming at in the end of the day?
Well, the end game will be the creation of an environmental condition which is not so transparently violent. I mean, I'm sitting here talking about this, and this massive thunderstorm has just burst over my head. So we need to get some sort of equilibrium in the ecosystem in which all living things can continue to live okay, where evolution can take its path. In other words, I can envisage an environmental trajectory which is entirely different from the destructive trajectory that we are moving towards. I mean, we are making the planet uninhabitable for many species, including ourselves, in the not too distant future. So that is one part of it. The other part of it is this enormous increase in personal wealth, where people like Musk and Jeff Bezos and so on just, you know, I mean, and at the same time, the whole utilization of the power that does exist of production, whether it is monetized or not, to actually build the kind of world which is going to be adequate for the requirements of living of the mass of the population, which currently is in turmoil.
Well, I think the costs of most consumer goods have gone down. Like I've said, I think it's the rent, maybe childcare, and a few other things have gone up. We do need to.
Well, yeah, well, it's interesting. You see, the one part of it sort of goes down while the other part goes up. I mean, you take medical care or something of that kind. You look at education. I was educated free. And now people have debts of, 200, thousand.
Let me add my 2 cents to conclude this. I agree that we need to change the structures. We don't change the structures by fighting what exists. What we have to do is reduce our dependence upon them and create new structures that provide for our needs alongside, and eventually make those old structures obsolete. And that's why I talk about creating alternative exchange systems, actually honest exchange systems, because the one we have is not honest, and alternative means of finance, which do not involve the imposition of usury. So there are two things. Individual companies, small to medium-sized companies, can issue their own vouchers as exchange media based on their ability to provide goods and services now or in the very near future, or through credit clearing associations, like banks have their clearing houses to settle obligations amongst themselves. Producers of real value can do the same thing. They can settle obligations amongst themselves by organizing into clearing circles. And we have both nonprofit and for-profit versions of that, historically and currently. The Veer Cooperative Circle in Switzerland was started in the Great Depression in 1934 in order for businesses to continue to exchange with one another, even though there weren't enough Swiss francs in circulation. And we have, over the last 50 years, commercial trade exchanges that organize mostly small and medium-sized businesses into credit clearing circles, where they can settle accounts amongst themselves without the use of conventional money. So those need to be improved and expanded and proliferated in what I call a global network of exchange that's locally controlled. The credit is locally allocated by the people in those circles, and yet we can use those credits globally to pay for what we need from whatever source it can be obtained. So that's my approach to beginning a solution to this problem. We also need to shift our savings toward investments in our local communities and rebuild the strength and resilience of our local communities based on local production, what Jane Jacobs talks about as import substitution. So with our own exchange media that's homegrown, we can begin to accelerate that process of import substitution and reduce our dependence on centralized systems provided from the top.
Okay, so while I have you guys here, I just wanted to quickly change gears in the interest of time. Just ask, there is currently obviously still a war raging in Ukraine. There's also has been a war in Yemen for 10 years, and they reached a truce last year, which seems to have held. Just wanted to, since this is about economics and war, and obviously sanctions lead countries to develop the kinds of things you're talking about, Dr. Greco, which is producing import substitution, right? If you can't import airplane parts, you have to manufacture them.
Mhm.
I just wanted to kind of, first of all, get your takes on, if you guys don't mind, what is your feeling about this war? Without, I've heard what you said last time, Dr. Harvey. I just wanted to get your take on what you see is happening globally, and what do you see? What is your opinion, I guess?
Well, I think it's very distressing. I think that there's a lot of transformations occurring, of course, in Ukrainian society. It's becoming a very neoliberal place, and in the midst of war. There is something happening in terms of an escalation of the war and the beginnings of a different kind of approach when the Ukrainians start putting drone strikes into Moscow. This is extremely dangerous, I think. I'm very nervous that we're going to end up with a nuclear exchange of some kind, or a nuclear accident at that plant. So I'm actually very pessimistic about the future of the war. I don't think it's going to end soon, and I think that the signs are that it's escalating, and that step by step as it escalates, so we get into more dangerous territory. And I think the dangers are becoming very, very significant, and it's not clear to me how to somehow or other roll it back so that those dangers are ameliorated. I'm very pessimistic as to what the future might be.
Well, I agree with David, but I want to put some historical perspective on this. The sources that I trust for informed knowledge are Scott Ritter, who was a former nuclear weapons inspector, spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and Colonel Douglas McGregor. Both of these people really know what they're talking about when they tell us about the historical development of this conflict. And starting with actually before 2014, with the CIA-assisted coup that overthrew the elected government in the Ukraine, and also prevented the implementation of the Maidan peace plan that Putin and others agreed to. So, this is all part of the objective of maintaining the hegemony exercised over the rest of the world by the U.S. and its Western allies, including Japan and Australia and New Zealand. And so I think it's largely a result of Russia, actually, I believe, fighting for its survival. And Scott Ritter mentions that, and so does McGregor. So, we in the West prodded Russia into starting this special military operation as a way of preventing nuclear weapons being stationed right in Ukraine on their doorstep. What would the United States do if Russia or some other power like China wanted to station nuclear weapons in Mexico or Canada?
Well, we don't have to wonder. The Cuban Missile Crisis was exactly.
We saw what happened in the 1960s. So,
Well, the difference in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's actually quite a few similarities in that the United States had sponsored the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a special military operation to invade.
And Kennedy opposed that. Kennedy
Cuba.
pulled the plug on that.
Right. It failed. They failed to invade successfully. But the next year, the following year, Cuba asked the USSR for protection, and the USSR placed nuclear missiles on Cuba, aimed at the United States.
This was really a ploy on the part of the USSR to get the United States to take missiles out of Turkey.
Right. Yes. Declassified information 30 years later revealed that, in fact, the United States had missiles already aimed at the USSR in Turkey.
Right.
And what's interesting is that Kennedy would not admit this publicly. It had to look like the Soviets simply took off, made a goodwill gesture, and they didn't get anything for it in order to sell it to the American public.
Well,
yeah, but see, I'm more concerned by the fact that if you look at what's happened over the last 6 months, there's been a real escalation in the nature of the weaponry that being given to Ukraine. It's becoming exceedingly dangerous and more violent. And Russia is responding, and I agree entirely, by the way, with the history you're talking about. But I'm very concerned about the actual dynamic that is going on in the last 6 months. And when I start to see that the Ukrainians are making drone strikes at Moscow and are attacking inside Russia, this is really dangerous. And I think the US is fighting a proxy war. And the US has to stop doing that because it's like getting the missiles out of Turkey. Yeah, there has to be some quid pro quo, and until I really do fear that there is going to be a nuclear exchange over the next 2 or 3 years, unless we de-escalate and start pulling things in a different direction.
Well, I just saw the movie Oppenheimer
as well.
I just saw the movie Oppenheimer last night. I think the movie is partially being released because of the overall tensions, maybe to inform the public. But look, can I push back just a little bit as a libertarian? Okay,
let's make that the end, Greg.
Okay, let's make that
for over 2 hours, and I need to take my nap.
Okay, I apologize. I just wanted to get as much from you guys. Okay, as much knowledge. So then I'll ask you a question, okay? And my question is, look, you've seen over the years, many decades, you've seen wars. You've seen the United States involved in war. You've seen Russia involved in war. And the Cold War had a lot of proxy wars, right? There was a proxy war happening all over the place, including sometimes secret wars like in Laos or Nicaragua with the Iran-Contra affair. Anyway, so my question is there anything different about this war versus other wars? Because I've seen, it's like this. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev created a direct line so there wouldn't be misunderstandings. And then they proceeded to use that to put in place disarmament treaties and nuclear drawdowns and all kinds of things which de-escalated. And what I see here is precisely the opposite. I just want to read you a quote and then ask you the question. By the way, I just for the record, as a libertarian, I don't necessarily see why it's morally less justified for Ukraine to attack inside Moscow when Moscow constantly bombs Kiev. So I would like to see the war end as soon as possible. And for that, the US needs to stop blocking peace agreements, like the grain deal. The grain deal was an amazing example of diplomacy in the midst of a war, and we should have more diplomacy like that, or like the truce in Yemen. But here's the quote I want to give from Kennedy, and then ask your opinion. So Kennedy gave the peace speech, a very famous speech that he essentially ingratiated the Russians and Soviets to Kennedy. To the United States, and It was a very conciliatory speech. And one of the things he says in it is very important. He says, I'm going to quote this just because I can't find it right now. He says, above all, Kennedy, above all, nuclear powers in the nuclear age, nuclear powers should not try to push the other into a choice between a humiliating defeat or nuclear war. In other words, he's saying in order, if we were to adopt such a policy, it would either show the collective, the bankruptcy of our foreign policy or a collective death wish for the world. So this is Kennedy, who has successfully de-escalated the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world is the closest it's ever been to a nuclear World War III. His conclusion, above all, is that we should avoid pushing the other country into a choice of either a humiliating retreat or nuclear war. But in our case, the policy is exactly that we must win, whatever that means, 100%, which certainly means humiliating retreat. As a libertarian, I mean, I think self-determination should come from the people, and we should oversee their own referendums, and they should decide who they belong to. And every year they should have another election and decide maybe to replace the governments with private agencies for their roads and their other things.
All right, Greg, I agree. So what's the point?
I guess my question is, what is in your history? You've seen many wars. Is this just another run-of-the-mill proxy war? Because it seems to me like it is another Cold War proxy war. But now the reaction is so different that it's like this is like we can pull out all the stops this time. Why do you think that is? Why? What has changed, essentially?
Well, in my view, we have a different power structure in the United States. Kennedy wanted to make peace. He wanted to avoid nuclear war. The people in charge of the U.S. government today, and I'm not talking strictly about the Democrats or Biden. It's both parties are complicit in this. You know, they're bent on global domination to bring in the new world order under their control. And so I don't know how far they're willing to go in order to bring that about, but it is a very dangerous situation. And what we have now with sending cluster bombs to the Ukrainians and encouraging the Ukrainians to attack Moscow and targets inside Russia is a further provocation. And we don't have the red phone, the hotline anymore for the leaders to communicate. That doesn't exist anymore, as you pointed out. So I agree with David. We're in a very, very dangerous situation.
But David, what do you think? Is this similar?
I simply have the question: who is trying to de-escalate things now? And the answer, I can't see anybody doing it. Maybe. I mean, the only hope I would have is that some of these discussions, which are going on with the Chinese, are possibly the Chinese and the US could broker a solution. But I don't think that's happening. But right now, I don't see any argument in favor of de-escalation.
The only broker that I see as being a viable possibility is probably Turkey.
Yeah.
And Graham Fuller writes a lot about Turkey and its pivotal role in that part of the world. So I recommend his work.
All right, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. We talked about economics. We talked about war. I hope to bring you on again. I think there's so much to discuss. We always go over. So thank you very much for coming on. Once again, I want to mention your books in case people would like to head to Amazon. So Dr. Greco, The End of Money and the Future of Civilization, if you want to read about his prescriptions for how to end the banking cartels and the governments they collude with and create an alternative. And also Dr. Harvey's book, A Companion to Marx's Grundrisse, body of unfinished work by Marx that clearly, at the end of his life, he had a very expansive view. And if you want to find out more, you can also watch our previous interview as well, where Dr. Harvey and Noam Chomsky discuss Marxism. So thank you, gentlemen, both of you, and we'll see you again.
Yep. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks,
Nice
guys.
to meet you, David.
Nice to meet you too.
Like to be the first to hear about Intercoin's roadmap and news? Definitely join and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to click that little notification button so you can get updates when the next video drops and the next time we interview a legend like Noam Chomsky or Patrick Friedman. And if you would like to participate in the conversation, go to community.intercoin.app. We'd love to hear from you and about your community. This is what the project is all about. Intercoin, bringing power to the people.